thank you very much to the previous panel. I know that this keynote stands between you and lunch, and I know that we're slightly behind in our schedule, but it really is a great pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Zack Taylor, who's going to speak about regionalism and legitimacy. When Meg and Josh told me that they'd invited Zack Taylor, and this is just revealing something about myself, I was terribly excited because of a very fine chapter on the Toronto waterfront that Zack authored. He's not going to talk about waterfronts, but anyone who wants to ask him a question about waterfronts, that'd be just great. He's going to be talking about regional governance. He's looked very closely at the Vancouver model in the context of other regional governments around North America. And then immediately following Zack, I'm very pleased that we have David Bragdon here, who is with the TransitCenter in New York, but before that was an elected metropolitan official, a really unusual and special thing in the North American context. And he's going to be providing some comments as a way of leading into the discussion, following up from Zack's presentation. So it's a really great pleasure to welcome both of them here. Zack, over to you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, to have returned to Vancouver from my perch now at Western University in London, Ontario. I was formerly at University of Toronto. I'm a political scientist. I'm a planner. I'm also a bit of a historian. So I'll fulfill Peter Oberlander's requirement that there has to be a history lesson, that there has to be some maps. So we'll get all that in there. Now, as we know, Vancouver and the Lower Mainland have a remarkable history of regional governance and planning. And I really do think that there probably is no better place in North America right now to be having this kind of a conversation. And I'm glad that Simon Fraser University is making these sorts of conversations happen. The title that frames this conference is Rethinking the Region. And the notion that the region needs to be rethought, I think, betrays a certain malaise as an outsider. You know, is the region, or more particularly Vancouver's brand of regionalism, truly in need of rethinking? Is Metro Vancouver at a crossroads, or is it merely experiencing a moment of self-doubt, a blip in what has maybe been a very long-term trajectory of success? The task I've set for myself today is to reflect on the sources of the Lower Mainland's relative success. And without giving away my punchline too much, my conclusion is that Greater Vancouver's regional governance is probably as healthy as it has ever been. It is no more or less conflictual than it has ever been. The problem, it seems to me, lies with the province, which is perhaps not done enough to enable and support regional choices. Now, oh, I see why everyone finds this confusing. Okay, there we go. At the dawn of the post-war period, Vancouver was really very much like many other North American urban regions of similar size and age. Outside of the city of Vancouver, you had ribbon development that stretched out like vines into Surrey, Langley, and beyond. You had patchy subdivisions splaying out south across the Fraser, eastwards into the fertile agricultural regions of the Fraser Valley. And large residential zones were served by septic tanks rather than by trunk sewer services. In fact, and this was even true in the city of Vancouver at this time. And there was no real relationship between servicing and subdivision control. So basically, things were not great. In 1961, the authors of a Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board report, who were actually working just up the street at lunch, you can run out and look at 426 Columbia and see where the original office of the board was. They wrote that the spread of Greater Vancouver consists of city-type houses on city-sized lots sprinkled about the countryside, little bits of city in the wrong place. So this was the problem that they were facing in the 1950s. Now, what do we have today? Well, today, after 60 years of incremental development of institutions, of implementation of policies, we see quite a different regional landscape. urban areas are now fully serviced by trunk water and sewer infrastructure. We take this for granted. Policy has supported a strict separation between urban and rural land uses. And that sprawl belt that was diagnosed in 1961, you see examples of it in Surrey and Langley especially, is now being filled in. You know, Vancouver, it's remarkable. It's the only North American region in which the rate of rural land consumption is less than that of population growth. Instead of flattening, the density gradient from core to periphery is becoming steeper. Densification is not just occurring in low-hanging fruit locations like industrial brownfields. It's happening across the established residential urban landscape. And indeed, the size of the region's single detached housing stock is decreasing in absolute terms at the regional scale, and I don't think you'd find that anywhere else. So we can debate the substance of these goals. We can debate their environmental, their social, their economic implications. But the fact remains that Lower Mainlanders chose their future. Your predecessors made this happen. There's nothing automatic about this outcome. So how did local actors devise and implement a coherent land use policy over an extended period of time to a degree that has eluded, I think, just about every urban region in North America? Well, to answer this question, I want to lay out a framework through which we can understand the legitimacy of the regional perspective on governance. And indeed, I will argue that creating and sustaining legitimacy is the core problem of regional governance, and I think that we'll find some resonance here with what Richard Hankins said earlier and others have said earlier today. Without legitimacy, there is no influence, there is no capacity to act. Legitimate authorities tend to be effective because people go along with them. They don't subvert them, they don't resist, they don't push back. Illegitimate institutions that are viewed as illegitimate don't get a lot done. Now, what this tells us is that the cultivation and maintenance of legitimacy is really a basic task. It's a dynamic, unending, often conflictual process, one that requires constant reinvention and renewal by champions. So I want to talk just a little bit, here I'll put my political science tinfoil hat on, and talk just a little bit about why regionalism in particular struggles for legitimacy. And then I'll interpret the development of regional governance in Greater Vancouver as a struggle for legitimacy. That's the history lesson. And I'll make a comparison to Portland, Oregon, and I'm pleased that David Bragdon is here and he can correct me on my misinterpretations. And finally, I'll offer a little bit of commentary on the present situation here. Now, legitimacy is the core problem of regionalism because the regional perspective on governance is at a systemic political disadvantage relative to other perspectives whose legitimacy is more entrenched. So what competes with regionalism? Well, the first competitor is what I call localism, right? The belief in community self-determination is deeply embedded in Anglo-American political culture. While limited in their capacity, in their activities, local governments are portrayed as the building blocks of democracy. Their institutions are the closest to the people, the most accessible to them. Localist rhetoric pervades debates, and I just want to share with you a couple of examples that could have been said yesterday, but were in fact uttered during the development of the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board's 1966 official regional plan. So Reeves Simpson of Chilliwack at that time, was quoted in the media saying, "All we want to do is be left alone, but you won't let us." Langley District Councillor Bill Blair said, "Look, the council is elected by the residents of today and not by future generations, and must give consideration to the wishes of those who elected them." So this is the essence of localism, right? Accountability through home rule, through local self-determination. Now, the second perspective on governance is what we might call sovereignty. Right? The federal and provincial governments are sovereign powers. They derive their legitimacy from the Constitution. While distant from the people, sovereignty is the ultimate collective expression of the popular will. It's the building block of the international system. So regionalism sits in the middle, right? It's the notion that some problems can only be solved in this gap, right? They can only be solved at a scale between the local and the sovereign. The regional idea has always emerged to address a governance gap that neither local nor sovereign governments can fill because they lack the jurisdiction, they lack the capacity, or they lack the electoral incentive to do so. So viewed historically, we see that localism and sovereignty predate regionalism by many centuries. The nation state is half a millennium old. Local governments date back even further into the mists of the medieval period. Sovereign and local institutions are mature, their legal status is secure, but regionalism is the new kid on the block. It's something that only really emerged with industrialization and urbanization in the 19th century. So how can regionalism elbow its way in to find a legitimate role in a political space that is monopolized by local and sovereign authorities? And to answer this question, I think we need to think a bit about where legitimacy comes from. If we know where it comes from, we can think about how to redesign institutions and reorient organizational behaviors to reinforce the legitimacy of the regional perspective. Political scientist Fritz Sharp proposes that there's 3 types of legitimacy, each of which is derived from a different source. And the first is what he calls input legitimacy. This is about representation. This is about how decision-making bodies are constituted. So we've already talked today, appointees versus delegates versus directly elected members of decision-making institutions. Well, in our political culture, I think we would agree that the electoral process, an elected body, is typically viewed as the gold standard of legitimacy. That's input legitimacy. The second is output legitimacy, and this accrues from perceptions of performance, right? The stakeholders in residents will confer legitimacy on institutions and policies if they benefit from the results, if they like those results. The third type sits in the middle, and he calls this throughput legitimacy. This accrues from perceptions of the processes that link inputs to outputs, accountability for decisions, transparency of decision-making, the efficiency of operations, and fair treatment of stakeholders. So if we compare regional institutions to provincial and local ones, we can see that not all of them derive their legitimacy from the same sources. On the input side, we know that provincial, federal, local, and local governments are directly elected. This creates a focus for political accountability through the electoral process. On the output side, provincial and local governments deliver services and programs directly to individuals, businesses, and households. On the throughput side, we know that provincial and local institutions receive greater media scrutiny. They're often subject to greater degree of systematic audit. They're legally required to inform and consult stakeholders and the general public, perhaps in a more thoroughgoing way than regional governments. So, by contrast, most regional institutions, including the regional districts here in British Columbia, are indirectly, have an indirect form of representation, right? They operate at a remove from individuals, households, and businesses. They are not directly elected. In other jurisdictions where these kinds of institutions are appointed by the provincial government or state governments, they too borrow their legitimacy from another level. It's an indirect relationship. So regional institutions generally have less input legitimacy than the other levels. On the output side, they often function as wholesalers rather than retailers of services, right? If you think of what Metro Vancouver does, it operates trunk water and sewer services, but it sells them to local governments, which then sell them on to the consumers, right? People are not aware of this. Regional bodies, when they function as planners, often, they rarely have the power to directly regulate the use of land. They set general priorities. They work through municipalities to achieve those objectives. So what all this illustrates is that regional ideas and regional institutions occupy a precarious space. Regionalism is sandwiched between and often squeezed out by local and provincial authorities that draw input legitimacy from direct election, output legitimacy from directly providing services to residents and businesses. So simply put, regional institutions don't get credit or blame for their work because they don't really touch people directly. So where does this leave regionalism? Given this position of disadvantage, where can regional governance derive its legitimacy? Well, short of the provincial government taking direct control and wearing it all itself, or perhaps amalgamating all the local governments together into a single-tier regional authority, I don't think we can truly solve the input legitimacy problem. There may be very good reasons for regional authorities to operate out of remove, so we may not be able to solve the output legitimacy problem. Staying out of parcel by parcel or project by project weeds can help maintain a clear focus as a planning institution, for example. When I think about Toronto, in 1988, making Metro Toronto a directly elected government was supposed to solve its legitimacy problem. All that did is create an entirely new front of conflict between local governments and Metro, it really led ultimately towards breaking the impasse through the amalgamation of the city of Toronto in some ways. So if we examine the history of North American regionalism closely, I think we find that the greatest potential for increasing the legitimacy of regional governance lies in the throughput dimension. And in particular, the way regional institutions cultivate and manage relationships with organized stakeholders and with the public at large, building trust and durable support coalitions along the way. So I want to spend a brief amount of time comparing Vancouver and Portland and their histories. These are regions that have quite a bit in common in a number of respects. In both places, the legitimacy of regional planning was painstakingly constructed, bit by bit, in an unlikely and very inhospitable environment. And this occurred through the strategic interaction with other actors of regional authority, working with local governments, with advocacy groups, and with the public at large. So they're very different structures that they have. Portland Metro is elected, Metro Vancouver is not. Metro Vancouver provides services, operates infrastructure systems. Portland Metro does not. What this says to me is that their relative success at shaping urban development, despite their very different institutional structures, suggests that there's no one best way to organize regional governance. The basis of their capacity to shape urban development is not so much a matter of their inputs or outputs even, it's a matter of throughput, of their cultivation of relationships and external support. So let's take a quick look at the Vancouver story. Now, I noticed in the promotion for this event that we are apparently celebrating the 50th anniversary of regional governance in our region. Well, I would submit that, in fact, we're celebrating the 103rd anniversary of regional institutions in Greater Vancouver. The origin of inter-municipal collaboration in Greater Vancouver is the province's creation at municipal request of the Greater Vancouver Sewerage and Drainage District in 1913. This occurred after the original sewage system failed. There were outbreaks of disease, all kinds of nasty things floating in the watercourses in the Fraser and in the bays. And as the drainage areas crossed local government boundaries, the chief engineers of Vancouver and then separately Point Grey and South Vancouver, they hadn't amalgamated yet, and Burnaby jointly hired the Montreal engineer R.S. Lee to come and help them solve this emerging public health crisis. Now, interestingly, Lee did not just tell them what to do, tell them what to build. He also designed a governance model. The province supported this project by incorporating the new board, and guaranteeing its long-term debt. And this was used as the template for a later water supply board that was created in 1924. Now, this design was very flexible. Municipalities paid in proportion to their share of the regional tax assessment. It was modular in that additional municipalities could join it on equal terms. And over time, they did expand to take in additional municipalities. And with modification, this was the template for the regional districts when they were created in the late 1960s. Now, importantly, crucially, these districts brought together municipal politicians and staff into routine interaction with each other, and this engendered trust and compromise over time. While ordinary people were likely unaware that these bodies even existed, municipal leaders came to see them as legitimate actors, and they supported their work and their expansion over time. After the war, the province enabled the creation of inter-municipal regional planning boards. Again, local request, locally initiated, but the province supported it. The Lower Mainland Board was created in 1949. It was similar in design to the sewer and water boards, structured as a federation of the region's municipalities, but covering the whole Lower Mainland all the way to Hope. And by 1952, it was fully up and running with a full-time executive director, the late Jim Wilson, a remarkable man, and a small but dedicated staff. Now, much of the board's time was taken up with managing relationships. While it was separate from the infrastructure boards, the two separate infrastructure boards, it worked with them to ensure that the infrastructure supported its emerging vision of a polycentric region in which fully serviced urban areas were separate from rural lands. Jim Wilson worked closely with the municipal delegates on his board. Many of these served for considerable lengths of time. Of the 183 people who served on the board between 1949 and 1969, 55 of them served for 4 years or more, so we see a lot of continuity. And this built trust across municipal boundaries. Wilson and his staff also visited municipal councils, and both the councils and staff members in the municipalities regularly. He also initiated what he called a Trojan horse strategy of offering planning assistance, preparing official community plans and bylaws, zoning bylaws for the municipalities on a fee-for-service basis. And he saw this as a Trojan horse because it engendered support for the idea of planning and land use regulation itself, and also the legitimacy of regional planning. They often encountered hostile crowds, people who brought guns to meetings and so on. While some municipal politicians and local business associations publicly protested the development of a regional-wide zoning plan, only Langley District ultimately held off. As the support of only 2/3 of the municipalities were required for it to take effect, it did take effect over Langley's objection in 1966. Now, crucially, provincial support was absolutely key to this. Minister Dan Campbell, Deputy Minister James Everett Brown, exercised quiet suasion to bring the municipalities on side. So by the end of the 1960s, a half-century of interaction through the infrastructure boards, through the regional planning board, had cemented inter-municipal collaboration. Through this constructive engagement, local politicians and their staff came to see regional institutions and their activities as legitimate. Now, this technical consensus on goals threatened to come undone in the 1970s. As elsewhere in North America, ordinary people became increasingly skeptical of government and expert knowledge. We also see the rise of environmentalism, new concerns. People wanted to have direct involvement in what they saw as important decisions. Environmentalists framed urban development not as a positive byproduct of economic growth, but as a harmful force to be contained. So to survive, regional planning would have to be seen as legitimate not simply by municipalities, but also by the public at large. And a new generation of planners at the GVRD, which had taken over jurisdiction over the regional plan, the 66 plan, recognized that the efficiency of land use was not enough, that they had to appeal to the emotions and aspirations of ordinary people. And I know some people in this room participated in this process. Now, to understand what people felt and believed, the visionary planning chief Harry Lash and his merry band of people, and people like Ted Rashley, and name some people of you might remember, engaged in an unprecedented public engagement exercise. What they discovered through this process is that residents were concerned about growth as a threat to livability. And so the notion of preserving and enhancing livability became the hook on which regional planning would hang. Now, it's exactly at this stage that regionalism's legitimacy was put to the test. In 1983, the provincial government responded to economic recession with a radical program of austerity and deregulation, and one of the casualties of this was regional planning. The provincial government abolished the regional planning function of regional districts and annulled all existing adopted regional plans. Now, despite its legal abolition, inter-municipal collaboration on matters of regional urban development continued, just propelled by these relationships, by the reservoir of legitimacy that existed. This was kicked into high gear in the late 80s when Gordon Campbell, then mayor of Vancouver, and Ken Cameron, who's here, aggressively built public and municipal support for a new planning vision, the Livable Region Strategic Plan. And the mass outreach program was repeated and expanded, and the livability theme updated for a new generation. This was given support by a new provincial government, which created a new statutory basis for regional planning, one that mandated municipal consensus on regional planning issues. So in essence, what that act did is it codified a half-century and more of established collaborative practice. Now, as those of you in this room know, all was not kumbaya, right? At every stage in the 60s, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, today, there have been very real disagreements and conflicts. The influence of regional institutions have ebbed and flowed over the decades. Like monsters in horror movies, the same conflicts keep rising up again and again. Conflicts over population and employment forecasts, allocation of prospective growth, land use, conversion of particular categories of land, and so on. Now, as an outsider, what I find remarkable is not that there is conflict. What I find remarkable is that the system holds together at all. Decades later, the contours of the vision that was crafted by Jim Wilson and his staff in the 1950s and 60s, and updated by Harry Lash and his band in the 1970s, remains intact. And this is because Greater Vancouver's leaders have continued to reproduce the legitimacy of regionalism through constructive engagement with outside actors. Now, we can see similar dynamics in the Portland region. The emergence of regional cooperation and planning emerged only gradually in Portland, and compared to Vancouver, much more recently, and with a really greater challenge, I think. Efforts to leverage federal mandates to create effective regional land use and infrastructure coordination in the 60s and 70s were largely unsuccessful, virtually entirely unsuccessful, I think. A metropolitan service district that was created in 1969 to consolidate the region's patchwork of small water, sewer, and other service districts. But that consolidation never happened. There was a regional planning agency brought into being to meet requirements of federal mandates. It was called CRAG. It was resented and resisted by member municipalities and counties. And much of the leverage that CRAG had exercised over the shape of urban development disappeared when the federal government withdrew its programs. That leverage disappeared. So neither institution in the 70s possessed much, if any, legitimacy on the basis of representation, on the basis of its interaction with stakeholders and the public, on the basis of what it did, because they didn't do much. Their consolidation into an elected body in 1979, today's Portland Metro, did nothing to increase this meager legal authority and the resources that were available. Early failures on the part of the organization did not really inspire all that much confidence and trust. And in its early days, local pressure resulted in a very permissive approach to the management of the state mandated urban growth boundary. So from this inauspicious beginning, it's remarkable that Portland Metro gained legitimacy, not primarily, I would argue, from being directly elected, but from a diligently pursued and multi-pronged program of engagement with municipalities, with interest groups, and with the general public. Downtown business leaders bought in because they saw regional planning as a means of reversing downtown decline. Urban property developers bought in because they appreciated the investment certainty that long-term planning offered. Ex-urban farmers who were suspicious of land use regulation saw benefit in rural land protection. And perhaps most importantly, the environmental group, the Thousand Friends of Oregon, became a vigorous funder of outside research and a defender of regional planning in the legislature and in the courts. This carefully nurtured external support coalition insulated Portland Metro from challenge from an unpredictable state legislature and citizen-initiated challenges at the ballot box. Metro also emerged as a convener of local governments for long-term transportation planning, bringing county, municipal, and state officials, as well as TriMet, the regional transit operator, into routinized interaction. In the late 80s and 90s, Portland Metro leveraged all of this incrementally built legitimacy to take on a more direct role in planning the region. And supported by Metro staff, committees of elected municipal officials and state agency representatives developed regional planning goals while simultaneously engaging the public through public meetings, focus groups, walking tours, and a media campaign. And the regional plan's development gained visibility and attention through the public advocacy of external proxies, including Thousand Friends of Oregon. So in the end, the Metro 2040 growth concept that you see here was successfully adopted in 1995, and its implementation has continued despite ongoing threats, despite ballot initiatives that have weakened the planning system, because local governments were bound to the process through these committees, in effect co-designing the plan, because Metro reinforced its legitimacy through the cultivation of outside support. So what these stories illustrate is the importance of relationships to the legitimacy of institutions and activities. While formal powers are important, their exercise is contingent on support from stakeholders and ultimately the public. Building legitimacy through interaction takes time and hard work. And Metro Vancouver and Portland Metro work as well as they do because they have creatively elbowed their way in and effectively navigated the conflicting interests of a diverse ecosystem of powerful challengers, powerful actors. And I say this as someone coming from Ontario, where the entire system of planning and infrastructure governance operates in a top-down command and control fashion. And the results are no better, and they may be worse, because the system is virtually designed to create conflict among municipalities and between municipalities and the provincial government. The result has been a 40-year-long slow-burning legitimacy crisis in which everyone and yet no one is in charge. And as the Greater Vancouver region continues to add 100,000 new residents every single year, the transportation infrastructure deficit that my region faces is so profound that even today's multi-billion-dollar expansion projects will barely bend the transportation curve. And believe me, Vancouver, you've got it good. You got it easy. So let me conclude then with two observations. First, regionalists should never be complacent. Never believe that past successes will generate future ones. Legitimacy can only be sustained through active investment in productive relationships, open communications, and accountability. I think the recent failure of the transit funding referendum illustrates what happens when legitimacy ebbs, when it isn't maintained. You know, it's the flip side of how the development of the Livable Region Strategic Plan in the late 80s and early 90s shows that legitimacy can compensate for all kinds of other negatives. Crucially, public support matters, even though regional institutions often operate at a remove. They don't touch ordinary people in a direct way. Regionalism must engage the public, not just local governments and the other formal stakeholders. It must do all that and more. Second, as I've observed the Vancouver story from the outside, I'm disappointed by the often antagonistic or obstructive behavior on the part of the provincial government, and not just over a period of decades. When you go through the ministerial files from the 1950s and 60s, the period of W.A.C. Bennett and the social credit hegemony in this province, you find that the provincial government played a quiet enabling role. It supported regional problem solving without engaging in direct coercion, without behaving like Ontario, in other words. So when growing suburban municipalities refused to join the Sewerage and Drainage Board in the 1950s, Minister Wesley Black created incentives that brought them on side. He made them an offer they couldn't refuse. When roughly 7 Lower Mainland municipalities refused at the last minute to endorse the 1966 official regional plan, Minister Dan Campbell worked directly and through the Social Credit Caucus to bring them on side. In the early to mid-70s, the provincial government applied quiet suasion to consolidate separate services into the regional district under one umbrella, one roof. So throughout, the province created the conditions for the region's municipalities to help themselves. And I don't believe that this was just benevolence or sort of technical thinking. It was a deliberate political strategy. The province had no desire to bring itself into overt conflict with municipalities. Like a judo master, it turned the energy of localism against itself, creating the conditions for localism to be accommodated to regionalism without compromising local autonomy and accountability to their own electors. Now, today's problems are different from those of the 50s and 60s. Local and regional governments are now fully capable of collaboratively managing land use and operating infrastructure systems. The region's actors no longer need to be persuaded of the benefits of regional planning. The broad contours of the land use vision are broadly accepted. The core problem since the 90s is mobility. It's how to support the land use vision with very costly upfront investments in mobility systems, the scale of which is beyond the capacity, the revenue capacity of local governments. So once again, the region needs the province to be a constructive partner that creates and sustains the conditions for intermunicipal goal setting and decision making. And it also needs to in conjunction with the federal government, to provide resources. Governance clearly is a question that needs to be looked at. Constituting TransLink separately from the GVRD seems to me to have been inconsistent with this long-term trajectory of intermunicipal cooperation under a single umbrella, the regional district. Vesting transportation planning in TransLink rather than in the GVRD severs the potential for a tight linkage between land use and transportation planning and creates new fronts of conflict between rival bureaucracies. So my recommendation to the province would be to take a lesson from its predecessors. Keep out of the weeds. Don't get into this sort of these local political games. Don't be like Ontario. Support the regional capacity to solve its own problems. You know, if the region's municipalities want to work together to tax themselves, let them be accountable for it. So it has taken Greater Vancouver a century to evolve regional planning and operating institutions that it has today. These institutions embody an almost unique collaborative ethic that has legitimized the idea of the region, of regional plans and policies, legitimized regional authority. I don't think you need to rethink the region in a way that makes it more coercive and hierarchical. Instead, I think you might need to rethink the role of the province. Everyone's task now, and especially the provincial government, should be to sustain and nurture this problem-solving capacity that's emerged over so many decades, and that has ultimately, despite many conflicts, served the region very well, and for so long. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zach. Over to you, David.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to actually agree with a lot. I know that certainly one of the things that we agree on a lot, whether we're from Ontario or British Columbia or New York, Americans, Canadians, we can all agree, we have a common conviction that lunch is a really important thing. So I'll be respectful of that as well. In addition to my credentials coming from Portland and being a practitioner of regionalism, I want to say in my current role with TransitCenter based in New York City, we do a lot of work on issues of governance. We did a report a couple of years ago about the problems that various transit systems around the country have. Sometimes they get misidentified as operational problems or financing problems, but at their core really are issues of governance and how things are organized and run. I also want to acknowledge our board chair is here, Rosemary Scanlan, who not only has a credential of having been a leader at what was once one of the most effective bi-state regional organizations, Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, but she's also a native of the area around Antigonish, Nova Scotia, so she brings that Canadian perspective up here with us as well. I want to really echo a lot of what Professor Taylor said. On this issue of legitimacy, you know, power is not a purely defined sort of thing. There's a gradation of power. There's a spectrum of power ranging from authority to influence. And a lot of planning work is toward the influence end of the scale. If I give you an example, authority are the clear yes and no sorts of things that government does, that murder is a bad thing. If you do it, you're going to be locked away. That's a clear issue of authority. There are aspects of planning that have that sort of type of character. Certainly in the Oregon case, thou shalt not build a suburban subdivision on farmland. That's an absolute issue of authority rooted in state law. But for many of the things that occur in planning, it's really about influence, especially not just preventing bad things from happening, but encouraging good things to happen, whether it's encouraging people to recycle or encouraging people to carpool. Really that government has to use the tools of influence, which, unlike the tools of authority, have elements of persuasion in them and have aspects of inducing behavior through interaction. And that's very true of intergovernmental affairs where multiple levels of government have to work together. There's very few cases in which we can tell each other what to do. And the regionalism certainly requires a fair amount of influence and persuasion and self-interest. You know, there was a French gentleman who came to the United States once upon a time, Frank, in the 19th century, de Tocqueville, who talked about self-interest properly understood. And so regionalism has to tap into localities' feelings of self-interest and willingness to identify their self-interest on this larger sort of scale. A couple of other thoughts as I've listened this morning. The first, and this is particularly from an American point of view, what a blessing that these things are at issue here. And while you've been through different iterations of regional planning here in the greater Vancouver area and different institutional structures, that in and of itself is actually kind of a blessing because it shows the mutability, it shows the ability of people to shape their institutions. We don't have a lot of that in the United States, frankly. The governing structures in Portland date to 1973 and really haven't changed very much since then. If I had a little more time, I'd tell you some of the shortcomings because the world's not the same as it was in 1973, yet our institution. New York City, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, was formed in 1968. Its governance structure is exactly the way it was then, 48 years ago, yet things have changed. And that directly contributes to our financial instability of the capital plan of that MTA. So it really is a blessing that you're more supple, you're able to look at these things and work on them. So hats off on that. Second point was that as I've listened this morning, I really, really do want to emphasize the relationships are more important than the institutional fact. I think Professor Taylor, absolutely right. Now, the structural things are important. That's certainly our view of things, but they won't do it in and of themselves without the right types of personal relationships, whether it's Joy McPhail and George, you have a provincial official and the GVRD official, initially, you know, from different parties and different perspectives, really different portfolios, yet realizing they ultimately have some common interest. In the case of Oregon, it was a Republican governor. This doesn't happen at all anymore in the United States, but it was a Republican governor and a Democratic mayor who recognized they had common interest, not the same interest, but an overlapping interest in the sense that the Republican governor was interested in protecting the farm economy of the rural areas and timber economy. The Democratic mayor didn't necessarily care about that. Those weren't his constituents. He was concerned about revitalizing downtown. Well, you know, planners would know those are two sides of the same coin, that having urban vitality and preserving agriculture on the edge of town, from a planning perspective, they're the same thing. But from a political perspective, it's often different officials. So having a Republican and a Democrat recognize that common interest, really very, very important. Denver's been mentioned several times. And again, there is an institutional part of that today. The Regional Transit Board, Regional Transit District is actually popularly elected. They have been successful at the ballot box for these funds that the minister talked about. But in parallel to that, there's also a Metro Mayor's Caucus, which is entirely informal, has no statutory authority whatsoever, and was convened by the business community, who were tired of seeing their suburbs fighting with their the central city mayor. And you had a mayor of Denver at the time, Hickenlooper, who said, okay, I'm in on this, through a philanthropic foundation, the Denver Foundation and the Chamber of Commerce. They said, we're just going to get all the mayors together. And they developed relationships that enabled some of these things that happened on transportation. The final point I'd make on this issue of the relationship between relationships and structures, a very wise man I worked with who'd been a city manager in a rural community in Oregon, and then now is a bureau head in the city of Portland. He said, good people can make a bad system work, but even the best designed system won't work if you have bad people in it. You know, so and I don't mean bad in a moral sense. I mean people who aren't apt at dealing with one another, so that deft people can make a bad system work, whereas a great system in the abstract, if the people don't have the relationship skills, it won't work. So just a couple of other points, and this is only one thing I would correct Professor Taylor on. I think the practical things that regionalism do are really important, and he said that the Metro Council in Portland doesn't deliver services. Actually, it does. It delivers some highly visible, popular services that people kind of get and they can associate with. One is running a zoo, which was going financially bankrupt under the city of Portland, and they regionalized the tax base. Another is a natural areas program, which was so great hearing Mr. Steves talk about that this morning as well, that identification with the broader landscape, people really get that in their hearts. It has nothing to do with jurisdictional lines. So there's a very very specific program, very tangible program where the Metro Council is buying land. People identify with that. In Denver, it was originally the stormwater floods. That's come up here from 1948 and the floods that occurred here. It happened in Denver in 1966, and it was an emergency, and suddenly these jurisdictions had to work together because it was a matter of life and death and property values. And so these very tangible things can be far more compelling than sort of an academic theory about regionalism being really important. It actually creates a value proposition and can lead to other things. The boundaries of Denver's regional transportation district today are the same as this stormwater district that they formed in the 1960s. Because once they had this thing going with stormwater management working together, they said, well, all right, transportation, I guess we'll have to work together rather than fighting about where the boundaries of that district are. Well, let's just use the district boundaries for the stormwater district. So practical things lead to additional things. Another point that I heard that I really would like to amplify, Mr. Henkin made this about citizen engagement and making this appeal to a sense of place, a sense of belonging to a place, and having that. That's been very, very important in Portland. Often local officials, they all identify with the jurisdiction that they're in. Real life people don't do that, right? I mean, if you were on an airplane flying between, I don't know, Tokyo and Seoul, and you sat next to somebody, is somebody going to say, well, I'm from Coquitlam, or you say, well, I'm from the Vancouver area, right? Normal people really do identify with the whole region, especially in this physical sort of form. Final point I wanted to make, and then we can have lunch, is that there are these moments of opportunity and clarity about definition in an intergovernmental sense. This ongoing issue of the role of the province here is very familiar to us. State governments in our society, I mean, I'm biased obviously, often play a sort of a destructive role or not a very helpful role with regard to urban regionalism because they have a different political dynamic. In our case, we suffer from it a lot in New York City, that the MTA is a creature of the state government, even though most of the money to pay for it comes from the fares, the pockets of the people, as well as a payroll tax paid in the region. Yet statutorily, it's controlled by the state government in Albany, which actually doesn't contribute most of the money for it. That's a violation of a basic fundamental of good governance, is that those who pay the bills should be those who make the decisions. So in our case, we have state senators from Buffalo, 300 miles away, far closer to Toronto, obviously, than to New York, have more authority over our MTA than a city council member from Brooklyn, whose constituents are actually paying for it. I can see, similar issues here. Obviously, that's come up this morning with regard to a portfolio where you have a provincial minister. It's really interesting that they've put TransLink in that portfolio, so that the broader transportation portfolio and the person who's worrying about Prince George and Kamloops is actually somebody else. Good, seems like a good idea. And then finally, the ultimate, and here's the real difference, the ultimate intergovernmental relationship, the role of the federal government. And boy, elections matter in this country. They don't really matter at the federal level in our country anymore, in the sense that the executive changes. We'll have a new executive, we'll have a new president next year, but frankly, it's not going to change the dynamic because of the way Congress is structured with checks and balances. you now have this opportunity that Portland really had in the 1970s, which is you have a federal government that's engaged and ready to be supportive. And the lesson from Portland there was getting their act together before going to Washington, D.C. with their assets, enormously important. Oregon's not a very big state. And so to have the suburban jurisdictions and the core jurisdictions, and at that time the state, all going back to Washington, D.C., saying, here's our list, here are the things that we want, regardless of city, suburb, Democrat, Republican, here are the priorities, that they had hashed that out among themselves so that the federal delegation, again, regardless of party, could say, I'm getting a clear unified message from the greater Portland area. They want 1, 2, 3, 4, and they were able to supply it at that time when there was a lot of federal money available in the U.S. So you have that opportunity now. You have a federal government that's pro-urbanist, pro-transportation, and it would seem to behoove you to really have a unified agenda and really take advantage of that and appreciate it while it happens. So thank you very much for letting me comment. I was really stimulated, and like I say, I agreed with an awful lot and really excited about the opportunities that you're working on here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Would anyone dare to ask a question? Thank you.
Thanks, Meg. One could argue that one of the best signs of legitimacy is the ability to raise and allocate funds in the public interest. And in this region, as many, you could argue one of the greatest sources of tension is about who's going to pay. Okay, so I'm wondering if either of our panelists, the speaker, could comment on, have you found a model where you, in a region, you have an investment, a public investment, a model where you can actually allocate funding, that the parties allocate funding according to who benefits, but the region gets the investment that it needs?
No.
Well, yeah. I think you said no, but go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that we have conflicting logics, right? On the one hand, we have different levels of government that have access to different forms of revenue, right? And local governments are not able to raise large quantities of revenue, and they have limited borrowing capacity. So they need upper level governments to be engaged, absolutely. So then you get into these accountability dilemmas and these joint decision traps, and that's a problem. The other logic is a tension between user pay and redistribution, right? And so we get into a difficulty with something like transit where, yes, you know, we could bring in actual cost accounting, bus route by bus route in some way, but that would be a very regressive thing to do. So how do we ensure that benefits that accrue to the region as a whole economically because of fluid mobility are shared across, right? And the thing is that you'll never come to an end point where you fix that in place. It has to be renegotiated all the time because the population changes, the economy changes, and different levels of government change as well. So,
well, I'll give you an example that Mr. Henkin will relate to, and that's why his comments really rang true with me. The Natural Areas Acquisition Program in the Portland area is a property tax bond. It had to go to the voters to be approved. It's been approved 3 times now. And it was structured very strategically. It's scientifically defensible from a biologist's point of view in terms, but it's also politically science approved, that it designated a certain amount of money that was regional and to be used by the Metro Council, but it was to be used consistently with standards and criteria about the biological value of the land being purchased by a variety of means, and there was a good scientific panel that validated that, and that appealed to people because, again, as he mentioned, I can't remember the name of the jurisdiction here, but so we were buying 3,000-acre sites next to a town of 10,000 people that itself would not ever have the fiscal capacity to make that purchase, and of course the land's going to be used by people from all over the region, but the measure was also structured with a local share that was distributed to each of the 24 cities based on their population, and that they also had to have a list that couldn't be stupid projects. They had to they also had to meet certain criteria, but they were of local significance, and they had a fair amount of latitude within those criteria. Those local councils had the ability to say. So it definitely could be done. I think it's much harder in the transportation field because you have these different operating entities and different ownership entities. That's why I found it really interesting that this notion Joy McPhail talked about the province devolving, arterials to the region and saying, there's really not a provincial interest. It's a legacy of the past. London, the most unified governance system in the world, really, for transportation is London, and that having one agency that is responsible for the arterials as well as the transit that runs on the arterials is really allows for more accountability, and that in turn gives people confidence when they're asked to put more money into it.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm aware I'm the last speaker perhaps before lunch, so I'll try and keep it quick. My name is Phelan Donnelly. I'm a graduate of the School of Public Policy here, and I work at the District of North Vancouver here in the region. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. It gave me lots of new ideas to think through these issues with. One thing I kept going back to through the presentation that was brought up at the beginning was this question of in whose eyes are these institutions legitimate? You said when you were discussing sanitation in 1913 that regular people probably didn't know who these people were in this institution, but they had currency or legitimacy among councillors or municipal aldermen. And so, that's interesting to me because when I think about, you have degrees in this and I've just been introduced to it now, but when I think about these kinds of issues here, my basic assumption was that part of the effectiveness of these, in regional districts in British Columbia, but particularly in the urban area, Metro Vancouver, part of the effectiveness stems from this insulation from basically the masses that, having, I guess, popular legitimacy. And so in my mind, because when we think about TransLink, part of the utter failure that we've just seen in public faith in TransLink is, in my mind, partially because they deliver a service that's just so impactful to people. They're too close to people in a sense. And so when that happens, if we throw up your matrix that you had earlier, when you start to get too close to, I guess, popular legitimacy, they evaluate whether you have any input, output, throughput legitimacy. And in that case, I think it sort of fails across the board, not just in throughput. So interested to get your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Well, I think one of the points I was trying to make is that legitimacy through these interactions, through these relationships over time, can sort of rub off on future events as they go, right? So in the 50s and 60s, you first had to have municipal officials buy into the regional idea. And then when the political culture changes and things widen out and people power emerges and the interest group landscape becomes more complex, those also need to see the institutions as legitimacy. But by then, the governmental actors were bought in, right? And so that created a kind of penumbra that spread outwards that has been incredibly successful here, I think. The TransLink story is a very complex one. It clearly has to do with perceived failures of operation, perceived failures of efficiency, perceived failures of accountability, and a sense that the board was not doing what it needed to do. So yes, the fact that was allowed to occur is a systemic problem that clearly is what's seized at the moment.
While I stress the importance of relationships, the importance of our legitimacy, the electoral origins of our authority and power on the Metro Council is really important. But it's particularly important and correlates most to those questions where there are issues of authority rather than influence. And the one that's most important for the Metro Council is deciding where the urban growth boundary is. And it's a very interesting political dynamic because it's the only place in our country where somebody actually runs for office with having to express an opinion about the extent of urban settlement. That doesn't happen in an electoral context anyplace else in the United States. And historically, even to this day, the Metro councillors are more reflective of popular opinion, which is to keep the urban growth boundary fairly tight and preserve farmland, whereas many of the elected councils in the suburban jurisdictions are not. But they're never really called to account for it because they only have a little tiny piece of it, and there's always this incremental idea. Well, we're just going to expand. So the elected legitimacy was a good trump card for me, but it was like the final card rather than the first. That when it would come down to, and again, it was something. The 7 votes on the, or 4 out of 7, so a majority on the Metro was enough to decide where the urban growth boundary was. We didn't really have to ask anybody's permission. I mean, in practical terms, you want to have goodwill and not have somebody, pay you back in some other way. But ultimately, it was our authority. So it was useful when you have suburban officials kind of saying, in a whisper, well, that's not what really, that's not what people want, and because they tended to be very tied to the suburban development interest. And I said, well, no, actually, we kind of know what people want, because I ran against a candidate in 2002, and my platform was to keep the urban growth boundary fairly tight, and her platform was to widen it, broaden it. And my platform was we need to increase transit, and hers was we need wider highways. And I got 58%, and she got 42. So, that's the best expression we have of public. We'll check again in 2006, and then 2010 and 2014. But for the time being, that's, if people didn't want that, they wouldn't elect the candidate. And the fact is, on the Metro Council, like, I think we did the math once, but it was like 21 out of 22 councilor elections, including in the suburban jurisdictions where all the voters were suburban voters, were all in favor of farmland preservation. And so I think that's very helpful in the Portland area, and that does not exist elsewhere, where you actually have elected officials who stand for office on what is generally a very diffuse and unaccountable type of decision, which is like how far the metropolitan area is going to grow.
Well, thank you both so much for wonderful presentations. We're now going to break for lunch. We have half an hour. We are going to start back on time. We've been given just so many corny metaphors, food for thought, a common enemy, which is not Ontario, it's hunger. Please join me in thanking our speakers and discussing.